So hi, my name is Pati. I'm founder of Historical Materialism Journal and book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand.
So, welcome to Historical Materialism Online 2021. And this conference, HM Online 2021, it's called The Return of the State, Anti-Capitalist Politics in a New Ecological Landscape, which is a cumbersome title, but that's appropriate since, as you all know, we live in cumbersome times. And that's the name of the conference, but this particular panel today, which I'm very excited to chair, is called Marxism and Contemporary Political Economy. So I'm Conrad Hamilton here. I will be your chair. And today we are going to present, various people will present 3 papers. And those papers will deal with the role of technological income in influencing the state of the pandemic. The second one will be a sort of study of zombie firms after 2008, companies with low levels of profitability, and how they came about and how they influenced the economy. And the third paper will deal with the use of the pandemic in India as a sort of pretext or state of shock to attack the rights of labor. And I will say right now, the names of these papers and the presenter. The first paper is Neoliberalization and Technological Dependence, the Past of Technological Rent in the Pandemic. And that's by Diana Furntes from the Department of Politics and Culture from the Autonomous University, Metropolitan Autonomous University in Xochimilco. I don't know my pronunciation. I'm going to bungle it, of course. The second paper is called A Marxist and Minskyan Perspective on Zombie Firms. And that's by Juan Graña from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Nicolás Aguila from the CIEPP in Argentina. And the third paper is called Engendering Precarity, COVID-19 and the Politics of Labor Law Reforms in India. And that's by Charvaak Pati, and he's an assistant professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India. So each of those papers will go for about 15 or 20 minutes. Then we will segue into a brief discussion. At that point, if you're there in the audience, if you're watching via YouTube, feel free to just put your questions in the chat and they will be relayed to me and I will be able to put them forth from there. without further ado, let's pass on to the first paper, Neoliberalization and Technological Dependence, the Pass of Technological Rent in the Pandemic. Diana, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you and send a fraternal greeting to all people, all comrades, all friends that are behind the organization of this conference that make it possible year by year and in these years of the pandemic in difficult conditions. And thank you. Well, I begin my paper. I have titled my presentation Neoliberalization and Technological Dependence, and I apologize in advance for my bad pronunciation, as Xochimilco is difficult to say in English. For us, the Hispanic world is difficult to pronunciation well English. Well, I begin. The pandemic caused by COVID-19 has violently revealed the monopoly, accumulation, and speculation of technological income, which determines the dynamics of dependence of a large part of the world on the large and scarce state of the art, technical, scientific production centers, mostly relate to private capital. The technological development, production, distribution, and sale of the various types of vaccines in circulation show the dependence of speculation and the private accumulation of profit obtained using technology rent. A few months after the start of the pandemic, only with the announcement of the first date that envisioned the first vaccines that could hit the world market, the pharmaceutical companies Pfizer and Moderna, without having yet demonstrated the effectiveness of their products, increased their actions in a matter of days. So by the end of the year, Pfizer closed million-dollar contracts to sell its vaccine to several countries. I insist, without having yet demonstrated its effectiveness. Meanwhile, the North American pharmaceutical company Moderna, in the middle of 2020, broke the historical record of the growth of its value as soon as it announced the positive results of phase 1 of the investigation of his vaccine. This rapid and disproportionate growth raised suspicions about the use of information to sell shares of vaccines for which there was still no reliable of precise data. Something similar happened with the drug remdesivir, sold with millionaire deals worldwide almost since the start of the pandemic. In this sense, so far this year, the World Health Organization has recognized that more than 80 of the vaccines developed by pharmaceutical companies has been applied in the richest countries. Although there have been many calls from very diverse sectors of the suspension of intellectual property rights for vaccines. To the date, they are still considered consumer goods. Hence, their prices are still under the command of speculation. This had made it possible for richer countries to purchase vaccines at high cost, but more immediately. For example, at the beginning of this year, some journalistic data reveals that Israel invested around 19 euros per vaccine, which represent almost double the cost that the European Union agreed with Pfizer. It's also known that the part of the commercial agreement between the Israeli government and the North American pharmaceutical company involved the anonymous demography data of people inoculated. In the first months of this year, another case worth nothing noting is the Canadian government's purchase of no doses of vaccines, its population 5 times. So the hoarding of vaccines so far this year by countries that highest income, but with 16 of the world's population lives. All this shows one of the most violent futures of geopolitical inequality that condemns much of the world to dependency. Despite many critical voices to raise against this form of biopolitics, whose capital material base has made visible the gap between the nations that concentrate most of the social wealth, the tendency has not changed. On the other hand, it has reactivated the function of states as managers between the most depraved speculation and the immediate need to immunize millions of human beings. Thus, the world is divided across national borders and geopolitical hierarchy between citizens vaccinated in advance and those others who are deemed expendable. The irrationality of capitalism becomes evident, for example, in the case of India, which is one of the largest suppliers of vaccines in the world, with the production of Serum Institute of India, which produces the vaccine developed by AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford, and Covaxin by Bharat Biotech. India has supplied the world with millions of vaccines. However, just a few months ago, it went through a tremendous humanitarian crisis caused by the second wave of COVID. And until this November, only 25% of its population has been fully vaccinated. Although the social critics have concentrated on the mechanism to combat the pandemic in different countries, pharmaceutical companies' speculation merits another explanation that questions not only the management of governments of their expertise or inability to protect their populations. The Marxian explanation of the violent phenomenon necessarily refers to study the production of extraordinary profit or surplus value. This kind of profit results from technological innovation that reduce the time of production, producing commercial advantage and in a constant and endless race that seeks to slow down continuously unsuccessful, the socialization of said innovations. In this dynamic, capitalists try to maintain as monopoly owners through technological rent, that is to say, through the profit generated by the sale of the partial or total use of the technology they own. This phenomenon explains the patent war and the painstaking effort to legalize and regulate ownership of emerging knowledge, even when its immediate application has not been discovered. In recent months, it is clear how the profit of the largest companies produced of the vaccines in circulation has updated the logic of the state monopolies that divide the world between rich and poor nations, with the social effect that this contracts. The thesis that explains the current function of technological profitability refers to Marx's statement about how the realization of the reproduction of capital can only take place if it establishes a relationship with another forms of wealth. Such is the case of the wealth of land rent. Moreover, as the Mexican Ecuadorian philosopher Bolívar Echeverría has pointed out, It is possible to recognize a mechanism similar to land rent in contemporary technological development. This last case is related to the continuous movement that leads each capitalist in search of increased productivity of the work process. That is, to the search for extraordinary profit, which has an essential function in capitalism since it unleashes its technological revolution over and over again. Thus, a technological discovery allows obtaining an extraordinary profit or surplus value at the moment in which, by having a technological improvement, an entrepreneur reduces production time and thus has an advantage over his competitors. However, this innovation is gradually socialized and the benefit is lost. It is therefore a constant and endless race. However, the capitalist or businessman who has managed to obtain this advantage will try to remain the monopoly owner of the new technology. Thus, this moment fosters technological rent, therefore the charge for using private technology. So technology behaves like the land, that is, as non-produced means of production. So it corresponds to the type of goods that have a price without having a value. They are goods that must be paid for, even though they are not the product of the work process. The characteristic of extraordinary surplus value is that it can only be detected as imprecise part of the price of other commodities. The presence of this mechanism for obtained profit, which in one way or another coexists but differs from the profits supported by the law of value, according with the philosopher Bolívar Echeverría, allows us to speak of the conversion of the extraordinary profit into a rent, a technological rent, so that the profit obtained by the owner receives for the use of his technology behaves as the rent that the land owner gets for the use of his land. This connection explains the war for patents and the painstaking effort to legalize and regulate ownerships of emerging knowledge. Our context in the pandemic is an example of this. The speculation and economic usufruct that has allowed the richest nations to accumulate vaccines shows how nations have to pay the pharmaceutical emporiums which have done everything to outdo the commercial competitors. So it can be clarified, helps to clarify the Borromean knot between scientific knowledge, technology, and capital. And it is on this level of analysis, the analysis of scientific and technological underdevelopment, to which entire nations are condemned acquires consistency. The key is how scientific knowledge is also marketable and how there is a structural inequality between countries, reproducing a logic of dependency. Thus, the technological development, production, distribution, and sale of the various types of vaccines have shown how geopolitics has allowed speculation and the accumulation of these in the richest nations of the world, as well as has led scarcity in vast regions of the world at the cost of the life of millions. This violent commodification of technological scientific production show the structural inequality between nations, which reproduces a logic of dependency that has been accentuated in the last century and represent one of the constitutive features of the proclaimed globalization of the neoliberal model. The policy of minimal states and the poorest nations meant the total or relative abandonment of the production of scientific knowledge in local development centers, preventing the development of autonomous productive capacities, regardless of whether they came from the state or private national industry. For example, in the countries like Mexico, neoliberalism abandoned investment in both and created greater dependence of the international market, causing millionaire transfers of state economic reserves to the private sectors of liberal corporation. To conclude, I want to say that the rent of the technology, it's the explication, is the key that can explain the profit that in this moment is caused by the speculation of vaccines. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Very, very interesting, and also I think in terms of Marxist political economy, sort of challenging thesis that you've advanced there, and there's a lot of consequences of that thesis we should discuss as well in the later. But now, getting to our next paper, we have a Marxist and Minskyan perspective on zombie firms, and that will be with Juan Martin Graña and Nicolás Aguila, both from Argentina. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah, can you share my screen? Can you see my screen, sorry? Yeah, cool.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for having us. For us, it's a pleasure to be at our first Historical Materialism conference, hopefully the first of many, and also hopefully next time in person. So our paper is about zombie firms, which have received quite a lot of interest in the literature recently. And this is mostly because these are one of the explanations for the low rates of economic growth and productivity growth in advanced economies since the global financial crisis. So for those of you who might not know, zombie firms are firms that cannot pay interest on their debt out of current profits. So these are firms that are extremely unprofitable because after they pay their financial commitments, they are left with a loss. So as economic theory from different traditions agrees on the fact that the goal of firms is profit maximization, when we have firms that are persistently unprofitable, it is believed that they should have exited the market. So why they continue to exist pushes a lot of interest in the literature reasonably, and thus the name zombie firms, as firms who should have been dead but are still remain alive. These zombie firms have particular characteristics, which are that they are less productive and they invest less than non-zombie firms. And because of this, when the share of zombie firms increases, it is expected that by a mere statistical effect, then average productivity and growth and investment as well should decrease. And because of that, they are used as an explanation for the trajectory of advanced economies, at least seen the global financial crisis. How they managed to survive has been explained mostly through getting increasingly indebted. They need to borrow for somewhere in order to pay for the financial commitments, as with profits alone, they cannot do it. And the literature argues, although we will challenge this a bit, that they get more and more indebted. And they say this is because of the low interest rates that we've been seeing since the global financial crisis, and the fact that banks do not want to write off bad loans, so they continue to loan to these companies. This topic is particularly relevant now because the situation has very likely gotten worse as a result of the coronavirus crisis, because as we all know, a lot of firms experience loss of sales, loss of income, loss of profit, and they had to continue paying their previous financial commitments, which were large in many cases, but also because they incurred in new financial obligations, whether loans by the state or by commercial banks, in many cases with government guarantees. So we think that the topic is particularly relevant as an empirical phenomenon, but the approach of the zombie literature has several flaws. The first one and most important one is that they have a neoclassical framework to understand firm competition and the dynamics of investment profits and so on. But also because their taxonomy, which is mostly zombie firms versus non-zombie firms, misses that within those two groups, there are several types of different capitals with markedly different characteristics. And what we will particularly focus today is the characteristics of the different types of what they call zombie firms, which in our view, refining that category allows to better understand what is the problem of zombies, which for the literature is mostly financial, as for them, the problem is that they do not get any profits left after the payment of financial commitments, but it's not productive. It's mostly a one-sided financial perspective. And what we will argue is that this is not necessarily the case, that there are firms who are in deep productive problems even before the payment of financial commitments. This is something that the current category of zombie firms does not allow to understand. So in order to address this topic, we built a taxonomy of firms, drawing on insights from both Marx and Minsky. And then we applied it to the US from the 1950s until 2019 using CompuStat. So we depart from Marx and his ideas in volume 3 of Capital, that once you include loanable capital, the cycle of capital is modified. Now, because the original M that we can see here, and hopefully you can see my my cursor as well, is borrowed money, and then at the end, this money has to be repaid. And because of this, the profit that productive capitalists get is divided in two: in interest, which they have to pay due to borrowing money, and what Marx called the profit of enterprise, which is what actually remains in the functioning capitalist hands after the payment of interest, which is what the zombie literature kind of focuses on. Following Lapavitsas, we divide this equation and we get that the rate of profit for enterprise has two determinants. One is R here, which is the rate of profit that the productive capitalists get from exploiting their own capital. Yeah, so it's because of this is more or less a reflection of their productive conditions. And then the second term here is what the functioning capitalists get from exploiting borrowed capital. And because of that is more or less a reflection of their financial standing. And as we can see here, it has two terms. The first one is the difference between the rate of profit and the rate of interest. And the second term is borrowed capital over own capital, so leverage. From this very simple equation, we already can deduce a number of ideas or results. The first one is that a firm that has low or negative profit rate will be in trouble regardless of its financial position. So it's important not only to focus on the rate of profit of interest, as the zombie literature does, but also on the rate of profit before the payment of interest. Then second, that a firm that does not use borrowed capital has a rate of profit equal to the rate of profit of enterprise. This is trivial. When the second term is zero, the two other things are equal. And finally, that as long as this here is positive, so as long as the rate of profit is higher than the rate of interest, a firm that borrows can increase its rate of profit of enterprise. Of course, this cannot be done in excess, because when you increase your leverage, or when a company increases its leverage, it can be more exposed to financial fragility. So it wants to borrow to increase its rate of profit of enterprise, but up to a certain point. Then this equation here is more theoretical meat, let's say, in a way. So we go to Marx to better explain what happens with R here, and we go to Minsky to better explain what happens with the financial term here. So let's go to Marx first. So we base our analysis on the Marxist idea that competition, capital competition leads to a differentiation between normal and small capitals. This is what Anwar Sheikh, if you're more familiar with his work, calls regulating and non-regulating capitals, but the idea is more or less similar. Normal or regulating capitals are those who determine the socially necessary productivity, and therefore they appropriate the general rate of profit. And small capitals are those that lag behind in the process of competition. They face higher costs, they are less productive, and they earn lower than normal profit rate. Of course, there is a variety of different types of small capitals according to their own rate of profit, but at least as a first step, we can divide between two types of capitals. But this doesn't really help us with the financial side. So for that, we go to Minsky. Minsky has this very well-known taxonomy of hedge, speculative, and Ponzi units. Hedge units are those whose expected cash inflows exceed their expected cash outflows in every future period. Speculative units are those whose total future cash inflows exceeds its total cash outflows. But at some point in the near future, this is not the case. So they have to get financing in the short term. So they are solvent, but they might be illiquid in the near term. And Ponzi units are those whose payment commitments are higher than its profits for some or all near future periods. So with this, we build up mixing the two insights, mixing Marx and Minsky, and based on the equation that we presented earlier, we create a taxonomy of 7 types of capital. 2 of them are hedge financing, normal and small regular. Then 3 are speculative financing, which we call speculative small, super small, and leverage small. And finally, 2 of them are Ponzi financing, which are the ones that we call financially stressed small and zombie. Zombie here is not the same as what the literature calls zombie, because what the literature calls zombie is what we, or what Minsky calls Ponzi firms. But as I said earlier, it's important to understand that there are different types of firms that are Ponzi financing or are zombies in how the literature uses the term. First, there are financially stressed small firms that are firms that have a positive rate of profit, which becomes negative after the payment of interest. So the problem is mainly financial. They do have even a low one, but they do have positive profits. While zombie firms, on the other hand, have a negative rate of profit even before the payment of interest. So their problem is really productive. It becomes worse due to financial reasons, but they are in trouble because of their productive standing. So now we show how the taxonomy performs for the US economy. First, we show the 3 big categories in Minsky's terms, and we can see that the share of hedge firms has been falling from the 1950s until after the Volcker shock, so until the early 80s. It's worth mentioning that the data for the first 20 years is more or less sketchy because there are not a lot of firms, but after the 70s is okay, so we trust that. And these are listed firms, so are firms in the US stock market. So we can see that the share of hedge firms have dropped, and in particular, it has dropped following increases in the rate of interest, more than anything, the Volcker shock, but with other spikes in the rate of interest as well. And then they recovered steadily from the beginning of the 80s until today. Then the share of speculative firms increases from the beginning of the series until after the Volcker shock, and then it decreases steadily. And more interesting, perhaps, is what happens with this share of Ponzi firms, which grow from almost nothing at the beginning of the 50s to a really high share. Moreover, more than anything in the 70s, following increases in the rate of interest. And they fall a little bit after that, but they still remain quite large in terms of the share. And this is what the zombie literature emphasizes, that there has been a growth in the share of Ponzi financing firms. But if we now look at our typology, what we can see is that truly the growth is explained more than anything for what we call zombie firms. That is not firms that are in financial problems, but really firms that are in productive problems. They start from almost nothing at the beginning, and in the 70s, they grew a lot. They explode after the Volcker shock, and they remain as the type of firm with the largest share for the US since then, reaching as much as 33% of US listed firms in 2001. So firms which are in productive problems are the ones that really explain the behavior of the US economy, not firms that are in financial problem as implied by the zombie literature. And then we can see also relevant that the share of normal firms has fallen from a really high percentage at the 1950s until the early 80s, and since then it recovered quite a lot, which is not surprising because the US economy has some of the biggest and more productive firms in the world. So it is expected that the largest share has to be that of zombie firms. And indeed, they have it in some years during the last decade. So if we now look at the characteristics of these firms, first of all, we can see the rate of profit. And here, as I mentioned before, the most clear fact is the negative rate of profit of zombie firms, which even gets more negative in time. So it gets increasingly negative as time goes by, and more or less stable relationship between the profit rates of all the other types of firms, which are all positive and all more or less stable. But then if we look at the rate of profit of enterprise, that is the rate of profit after the payment of interest, we can see that, this gets even more pronounced, that the profitability of zombie firms is even lower. Now we can also see that the rate of profit of what we call financially stressed small is negative as well. And also very interestingly is that the rate of profit of enterprise of hedge financing firms grows in time. So they get increasingly differentiated from the other types of small firms, as normal firms and small regular firms are able not only to appropriate a rate of profit from the exploitation of their own capital, but also from the use or the exploitation of borrowed capital. As we said in the equation earlier, there are two things that can explain a difference between the rate of profit and the rate of profit of enterprise, which are the difference between the rate of profit and the rate of interest and leverage. So what explains the difference here is more than anything the difference between the rate of profit and the rate of interest. As we will show now, leverage is not that big deal. In fact, both for normal capitals as well as for zombie firms, normal capitals have a big difference between the rate of profit and the rate of interest of 8 percentage points, and zombie firms have a huge difference between the rate of interest and the rate of profit of 26 percentage points. While leverage is not that high, zombie firms have really low leverage and normal capitals as well. But for what matters here, again, the low leverage of zombie firms really emphasizes that their problem is not really financial. It's, again, productive. It's their negative profitability even after the payment of financial commitments. So to conclude, what we want to emphasize is that the coronavirus crisis struck a US economy that had already a really high share of firms with productivity and profitability issues. And this is not something new that happened after the global financial crisis, as argued by the zombie literature, but rather that's been going on since the late 70s. And because of this, not surprising that we are seeing a recovery marked by supply side issues, right? Which are now appearing, expressing themselves on inflation. But well, if these are the firms that have the highest share, firms that are more worried about repaying interest instead of investing, it makes sense that we will see supply side issues. So what to do? What we suggest is that financial policies are misguided, both if they are of cheap rate as well as if they are of financial normalization. Policies of cheap credit are insufficient because they can only manage to expand artificially the life of zombie firms, as has happened for the past decade or so. But financial normalization will be a disaster because these firms will go bankrupt and there will be a massive loss of jobs and financial instability. So the conclusion for us is that state intervention should be bolder and it should combine industrial policy with direct credit allocation. So in order to address the productive problems of the economy, industrial policy is needed again, and credit policy should play an industrial role. In this way, it will be possible to let the zombies go to their graves while redeploying resources from these socially unnecessary and unuseful companies towards companies that can support a green transition, for example, or play a role in socially necessary activities, and in this way achieving high levels of employment and wages. So this is it, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Juan and Nicolás, for that paper. You know, it's certainly a complex area of political economy, and I think I speak probably for everyone in the audience that we're grateful to see it analyzed with Marxist tools. Right. So now we, taking a dramatic turn, we have our final paper, Engendering Precarity, COVID-19 and the Politics of Labor Law Reforms in India, with the attacks on labor rights in that nation, for which COVID-19 has been used as a pretext, and obviously a very, very dramatic impact on India, COVID-19. And this will be presented by Charvaak Pati, who's an assistant professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India. So go ahead, Charvaak.
Thank you, Conrad. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now I can, yeah.
Yes, yes. As the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the world and infections surged, a stringent national lockdown was imposed in India on 24th March, that is last year, 2020, to halt the proliferation of the disease. The lockdown was unplanned and enforced with just 4-hour notice, bringing the economy to a grinding halt. The immediate effect was widespread large-scale unemployment. It is migrant workers who were particularly hard hit by the lockdown. There were images of hundreds of thousands of workers marching to rural villages after they lost work in the urban centers. It was expected that lockdown would cause a significant contraction in the economy, and there was a lot of uncertainty over recovery. It was not long before deliberations began at the policy level to revive economic activity as early as possible. The first round of lockdown the stringent lockdown was for 2 months. It was implemented in March and continued till May. So by the end of May, the gradual easing of the lockdown had started and limited economic activity began. Fiscal and monetary measures for supporting economic activity were discussed. A lot of steps were announced on the manufacturing sector, including micro and small and medium enterprises. Providing temporary relief from repayment of loans was announced by the government. However, the government took a very radical step. Several state governments, the provincial governments, to facilitate economic revival. State governments offered relaxations in state labor laws. So in India, labor is a subject is a subject on which both the provincial and state central government can make laws. The usual practice is that state governments then make their own laws, and the central government formulates broad guidelines. But whenever there is a conflict between state laws and central laws, the central laws prevail. So the state governments offer relaxation in state labor laws to generate more employment, supposedly, by removing the rigidities in rules and regulations related to labor management. The states hope to position themselves as attractive destinations for private capital. The situation resulting from the pandemic had presented the state governments with the opportunity for an overhaul of labor laws. While the central government started the process of consolidating and making huge changes in central labor laws in 2014, the states set off aggressive deregulation of labor laws, citing the pandemic as a reason. It was argued by these governments that relaxation of the laws was necessary to deal with the loss of employment and encourage private companies to hire more workers without being encumbered by India's supposedly, quote unquote, inflexible labor laws. The governments acted with speed and did not bother to apply any necessary oversight mechanisms. When the pandemic and its economic fallout were wrecking working people's life across India, there is a need to question the need for an urgency, the usefulness of these changes, and the potential for the misuse. In August 2014, so I'll give you a background of what was happening before these state governments came up with these changes in 2020. In August 2014, soon after the current incumbent government led by the Bharatiya Janata Party came to power in the center, the process was initiated to turn 44 labor laws, central labor laws, into 4 labor codes. With a clear majority in the lower house of the parliament, the government emboldened to proceed with reforms which were till then regarded as politically imprudent. The codes were on occupational safety, social security, industrial relations, and health and working conditions, codes on wages. These codes are part of what a long-time observer of Indian political economy, Rob Jenkins, characterizes as second-generation reforms. These reforms have been left unaddressed after the introduction of economic reforms in 1991 and subsequently ignored by these successive governments. So what the BJP-led government, the current government, sought to achieve was to complete the unfinished business of India's first generation reforms, which include the liberalization of agriculture sector as well. So, perhaps you're aware of the fact that there have been changes in farm laws as well, and a year-long farmers' movement is still ongoing in India, especially in Western India and Northern India. So labor reforms were considered essential to changing India's industrial relations regime by relaxing the conditions under which workers can be hired and fired, as India's labor regulations were regarded as unsuitable for its globalized economy. Multilateral institutions like World Bank, Corporate India, and a section of the economists, proponents of free market economists, regarded the country's labor laws as too rigid, preventing firms from aligning their labor requirements to changes in demand and supply conditions in the market. The absence of flexibility, it was argued, impeded firms from competing efficiently in global markets, which is, of course, they argued that was critical to the success of new growth strategies. So the focus of these conversations on labor reforms were on ease of hiring and firing, changing the criteria for recognition of unions, and finally, arbitration mechanisms for settling employer-employee disputes. The demand for reforms fell under 2 distinct domains. The first had to do with giving firms more power in their workplace to make appropriate adjustments to the size of the workforce. And the second was aimed at reducing the transaction cost of arbitration dispute resolution. Since the existing labor laws help only a tiny fraction of workforce engaged in the organized sector, there is an apprehension that the anomaly has created an elite group within the workforce. That's what the discourse is driven right now. That the existing laws do not work to the benefit of an overwhelming majority of workers and who are leading an insecure existence. Therefore, changes are necessary. Flexibility is the need of the hour, which will create more employment opportunities. It is not just the current government which was very want to introduce these changes. The previous governments also set up committees to introduce changes, to suggest changes, but they could not achieve those tasks because they did not have a majority in the House of the Parliament. So the BJP-led government, the current government, has majority in the House of the Parliament, and they could, proceed with the changes without much difficulty. A lot of provincial governments in 2014 brought in amendments to the labor laws, the Factories Act, the Industrial Disputes Act, Apprentices Act, Contract Labor Act, and so on. Well before the central government initiated these reforms, the state governments were already competing with each other to deregulate their labor laws. I mean, Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, and Maharashtra were some of the states which were already doing that. Just before the union government was about to place the new labor codes before the parliament, the pandemic struck, which stalled the parliamentary processes. However, state governments pursued these changes aggressively by introducing ordinances completely bypassing the convention of having tripartite consultations. The consultative processes were themselves under threat for several years. The annual Indian labor conferences were not held regularly, and no meeting took place after 2015. In its place, the union government has constituted a standing committee that does not consider inputs of trade unions anymore necessary. Tripartite forums have been abandoned. So what happened during the pandemic? Several state governments suspended the existing laws regarding wages, regarding union formation, regarding employment of children and women. They suspended Minimum Wages Act, Industrial Disputes Act, and firms, they introduced one provision where firms with fewer than 300 workers can now lay off workers without government's permission. The earlier threshold was 100 workers. Fixed term employments were introduced. The states were free to decide what was a normal working day. There are several other states passed resolutions. For example, there is a state in Western India called Gujarat, where the present Prime Minister come. It suspended major labor laws for 1,200 days, close to 3 years. So, the working hours were extended from 8 to 12 hours. Safety regulations were suspended. For new establishments, those who are willing to set up factories in some of these states, rules governing industrial disputes, strikes, and lockouts were not applicable. So the ordinances is that there was an implicit consensus among various political parties with regard to these reforms. State governments defend regional party backed governments, to national parties, BJP and Congress-led governments, state governments, all of them were in unison in implementing these reforms. With the end of the lockdown, these reforms, some of these steps were taken back, but there was a lot of support. There's a lot of ideological support for these changes. For example, an industrial body is called ASSOCHAM. It announced that the changes are necessary to make India an attractive destination for FDI. In a similar vein, there is another powerful industrial body, Confederation of Indian Industries. which declared that these reforms were one of the most important factors to restart economic activity in India. So the ostensible target goal was to compete with China. The success of China's industrial policies is cited again and again by policymakers to make India a base for manufacturing. And therefore, there is, the argument goes that there is a need for massive overhaul of labor reforms. The central trade unions protested vehemently, but it did not have any impact on the course of these policy changes. So, why were these changes introduced? There was the rationale given for reforming these labor laws is the need to make labor market more flexible, right? It has been made the argument. However, there are certain other contrasting features that exist in Indian economy. Close to 93% of the workforce is employed in informal sector. So it is not clear how a small formal sector operating under supposedly rigid laws hinders labor market flexibility. In case of labor disputes, the judiciary has been predominantly pro-capital. Labor laws have been considerably diluted in special economic zones, in export processing zones, industrial model towns. Similarly, rules and regulations governing trade union formations, collective bargaining by workers, and contractual employment provisions are routinely flouted in many industrial zones. The famous case of union struggles at India's largest automaker, Maruti Suzuki India Limited, is a case in point, right? So why is the government trying to go through through these reforms, and why did it take the advantage of or use the pandemic as a pretext? There are a couple of plausible explanations. The central government is in overdrive to privatize a lot of state resources, insurance, banking, railways, airlines, ports, roads, and the public sector unionism has been pretty strong in India, right? So one explanation is that by implementing these laws, it wants to kind of prevent any kind of large-scale labor mobilization against these policies. Second explanation could be that there is the rate of unemployment is really high in India right now, and it could backfire. It could put the current government's electoral prospects and electoral prospects in jeopardy. It could really endanger that. So the government is following two strategies. One, it is using its rhetoric of Hindutva, right-wing ideology. And second, it is using these labor laws to drive an ideological point that so far organized labor with secure contracts have been the only beneficiaries of these laws. And now is the time to bring in more flexibility to create more employment opportunities. But the bottom line is that the reforms will adversely impact the hard-won rights of labor and to collectively bargain in safe and secure workplace. Perhaps the government is trying to preempt any possible resistance, strikes, and large-scale mobilization. So I'll stop here. Maybe I can clarify a lot of things during question and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for, I think, a very informative presentation. So looking on at the chat, I see we don't have any questions so far, unfortunately. Perhaps also that has to do as well with some of the complexity of the material, which I think can be a bit hard sometimes to kind of get your head around. But maybe I'll start you guys out with a question. And just kind of see where we go from there. So I just want to say, Diana, in your account, I feel like, and perhaps justly so, you treat, sort of technological income, the creation of, I guess, what Marx would call super profits, right, in this way, as fairly ubiquitous, very, very common, right, within these sort of vast technological sectors. What do you think the implications of that would be for something like Marx's thesis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, right? Because if, as you say, people are making all this money, but it's not value, right? Then do you think that renders which was always a provisional, it was never finished, right? The third volume of Capital. But do you think that would render that, obsolete or inaccurate, the thesis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or no?
No, of course not. Well, I think that we can't mix or we can connect all this because the idea of technological rent, it's connect with the thesis of Marx that the competition, the irrational competition and constant competition in the capitalism that had different phenomena that produce the necessity of revolution of how can I say it, of make better all the condition of technology is in the centrum of this problem, no? And one way of have an extraordinary profit is this phenomenon that is strange that with the capitalism has to convive to life but it's a strange phenomenon as well is the rent of the land or the rent of a classical wave of the land and the way of get a profit of the private land own landers. Excuse me, but I want to say that this is connect necessarily because the rent of the technology is a phenomenon derivated of the necessity of the capitalism of make a constant revolution of the technology that goes necessarily to this problem of the tendency, I don't know how to say, but the tendency caída de la tasa de ganancia, we say.
Tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
Thank you.
It sounds better in Spanish, though.
Well, I think, but well, I think that it's totally necessary to think these both things and those phenomena that are, I think, very, very contemporary and very actually. And excuse me for the explanation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if I understand you properly, and maybe just to underline that, what you're getting at is that, I mean, and I think, obviously this thesis has existed before, the idea that the use of technological income is actually imminent to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, insofar as an attempt to bypass the difficulties at generating profit, which that engenders, right? Would that be a correct understanding of what you're saying? Okay.
Yes, I understand. Well, no.
Sorry, you said what you were saying?
No. I understand, but I think that well, there's another phenomena that are more contemporary that try to regulate this tendency, and one of these is this phenomenon that give us make the that make the rent of technology. well, I finished with that.
Okay. All right. And by the way, if anyone here wants to jump in or ask the other presenters something, just let me know, and you'll have the opportunity to do that as well. It's not just me having to do this here. So the next question I kind of wanted to ask, and maybe I sort of, you alluded to this and I kind of missed it. But for Nicolás and Juan, I was reading, I mean, what you're talking about are a lot of unhealthy symptoms in our economy since maybe especially 2008, but of course there's a larger trajectory in which these things can be analyzed. One thing, I was reading Michael Roberts, because Michael Roberts has, of course, this wonderful blog, right, on Marxist political. I am a Roberts fan, I have to say. Because he always does the rate of profit-based analysis, which I like as a style. But one thing Robert said was, he said, if you look at, and he was talking about zombie firms in particular, and he said, well, look, he said, probably in hindsight, when we talk about COVID, bourgeois accounts of history will say like, well, COVID came along, the economy crashed, okay. But he said that in actuality, a lot of these indicators were so poor, right, that it's likely that there would have had to have been a major crash, even if COVID had not happened. What do you think about that? Do you think it was inevitable that there would have been something like this sort of wipeout that we've experienced in the last couple of years?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's impossible to know, especially the deepness of this crisis regarding the pandemic probably wouldn't have happened. But as Nicolás was stating in the presentation, this is a long-run trend of zombie firms that are unproductive, that have been growing since the 80s. And if you look at the global process of accumulation since the 2008, it has been unhealthy everywhere. Growth rates have been really down, investment have been down, and wages have stagnated all around the world, except for some countries in Asia. So it's probable that the accumulation of debt, especially in financial countries that have really, really big problems, like mine, like Argentina or Turkey or Brazil, whatever, that we are usually in the inside of international creditors, but especially companies. Now, you only have really a good dynamic in digital economy, the big tech, the GAFAM, but everywhere else, the economic situation was not very good, and the pandemic hit really hard in most countries, and the labor market is especially in a dire situation. Well, Charvaak was stating what happened in India, and in many countries, labor laws have been in question in the last couple of months, especially in order to appropriate the recovery. How is the recovery gonna be distributed between capital and labor? And what you are asking, Conrad, is, yeah, it's probable that we need to rediscuss how global capitalism has been working since the 80s, since the Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberal redoing. So I think this crisis, the 2008 crisis, the Corona crisis, are part of a big question that how is the economy gonna work from now on? If you attach to this the problems of the ecological crisis, I think the question is now more dire than ever. We have to answer, we have to give an alternative of how capitalism is gonna work on the next few decades, and I think this is the big question. I think the Corona crisis, as you said, Conrad, is gonna move into the background a lot of problems that capitalism was aggravating in the last couple of decades, but I think the problem is not going to go away. Debts are high, wages are down, employment is high, so I think a restructuring is needed, and I think what we are losing is really an alternative. We are discussing several points detached from the global dynamics, and I think this is the way and the place to discuss these things. So I'm agreeing with you and with Roberts in that point.
Okay, thank you. So maybe something, I'm just going to double check the chat here, see if we have anything. So maybe something useful to do now is, I thought, here at HM, one thing I thought was a bit of a omission is we didn't have any panels about China, which I think is really, really pertinent if we're talking about, political economy at an international level. So I wanted to just, I had a couple of questions maybe related to how sort of China ties into this larger picture, if you guys think you're equipped to maybe tackle that a little bit. And I have them for, one for Diana and one for Charvaak. So let me just start out with Diana. Now we've been seeing, lately in China, there's been a sort of crackdown on big tech, right? We've seen that obviously it was very visible that Jack Ma sort of disappeared suddenly and came out, and he seemed very, very sort of humbled, right, in terms of the way he was speaking. There's been tech companies in China, like Tencent and so forth, have been basically compelled to give very large donations to government-run charities. We've seen more and more public firms being purchased publicly. So how do you think that it would be fair to say that China is moving to sort of take national political control of the situation, in which you're seeing these monopolies that are building themselves up through tech rent? And how constructive or how viable do you think that agenda is, if so?
Well, I don't know if I can ask that question because it's very difficult to me, but I think that the problem in this case and in another cases similar to this is that the political way that they take has to do with the form that they can't produce a certain harmony between the push of the economy and all the social problems that they have to resolve. In this, and I think in these years we have heard that there's critical voices that insist that we are arrived in a moment that the states are taking certain ways of trade with the problems that are so radicals, I don't know how to say it, so stark with the people, with the population. And the example that used to this is precisely China. But I think that the problem is not only the political ways of dealing with the problems, but also this dynamic and this discussion between in all the world between of the model of neoliberalism in one hand, in another the problem of new models of neo-Keynesianism, like it's happening in Mexico, for example. I think that this is the problem now in the world. And I don't know if I ask the question in a good way, but I think that this is the political economical problem today, no? In many countries, and I can talk about Mexico that is an example of that, no? But that's all.
Thank you very much for those comments. Now I'm going to ask Charvaak something. Charvaak. So obviously, at least as an international observer, right, looking on at what's transpired with the pandemic, in spite of seemingly emanating out of China, we've seen very, very different consequences for China and India. Right. In India, I think I saw a negative 27% economic losses. China was +3. There was more success containing the pandemic in China once it had sort of broken out. And then recently I read that we're seeing divestments from certain firms. So I know General Motors, for example, has recently withdrawn from the Indian market. So there's a real change in the sort of tenor of conversation, right? Because I feel that you know, in some of the years before the pandemic, the tone was sort of, well, India is going to be the next, you know, new site for investment. It's going to boom. It's going to replicate in some sense the success of what transpired in China. I think the tone has changed a lot in those conversations, particularly after COVID. Obviously, China is not perfect, right? You know, and Samir Amin, you know, even will say, well, look, when we look at these, you know, statistics of their fantastic success, we have to understand that they're not always so accurate with respect to the experience of people on the ground or the way they're tabulated. But in terms of this response to the pandemic, what do you see as the causes of you know, the relatively the stronger response or more effective response that we've seen in China? What do you see as the causes of that?
Causes of India's response to the pandemic?
I meant comparing China, the differences in the responses. What do you see as animating that?
I don't know if I can address the China part of the question.
Okay.
But I can perhaps give an answer to the India part of the question, right?
Okay. Okay.
If it is about the laws, right? I think there has been a lot of policy discussions going on in India that since a lot of these global supply chains or value chains, that's what it's called, is located in China, and because of the pandemic, there's a rethinking about its location, and there is a possibility that it could move to other countries, and India wanted to, you know, portray itself as an attractive destination for this supply chain, you know. And also there is a slogan which has been given, and it's more ideological driven than it's has its objective, or it is based on objective parameters. That's Make in India, right? I mean, as you pointed out in the beginning, that there is, you know, perhaps India could compete with China and so on. So there is a policy that will make in India, make it a manufacturing power base, right, to compete with China. Perhaps the government has found an easy way out by, you know, making the labor costs inexpensive. That's how I look at it. But more important than that is that I think it wants to crush or whatever is left of the organized labor. Mm-hmm. That is, I think, one of the reasons why these laws were introduced, and the pandemic was provided a context, because parts of these different laws were introduced by different governments, but state governments, as I said, you know, passed these reforms through ordinances, not through legislative routes. There were lockdowns, so there was no possibility of a strong trade union resistance. And now these laws have been passed by the Indian Parliament in September, October, right? It hasn't been implemented. It has been put on hold because there is already a year-long agitation movement going on against farm laws by Indian farmers, the strong farmers movement going on. So perhaps keeping that in mind, these new laws have not been implemented, but will be implemented pretty soon. I mean, you know, maybe in a couple of months, maybe 2 to 3 months. So I think it's more about to completely do away with, for example, any kind of organized resistance. For example, I mean, I just could not show it on the slides. There is a provincial government in Northwest India. It's called Punjab, which is a hotbed of the farmers movement. There is an investors meet, right? And the advertisement goes like this: Progressive Punjab, peaceful workforce, liberal policies, no labor unrest, lockouts, no domicile restrictions on hiring, and 24/7 shifts allowed across genders, right? So it's both to present itself as a very investment friendly. The states are competing among themselves. So the scalar nature to this sort of class-based politics. States are competing among themselves, so it will leave the door open for more regressive labor policies, right? And the pandemic just provided a context, and the unions have been pretty ineffective in resisting these changes so far. I don't know how to answer the China part of the question.
Okay, well, let me just, and I'll get to you, Juan, in a minute, because I know you wanted to say something, so we'll come around to you in a second. But let me just ask you this, and I think this is important. So let's say, because obviously, in terms of attracting foreign investment in China, low labor costs were a big part of the attractivity. But there were also, significant factors in terms of the extensive industrialization in areas of heavy industry accomplished under Mao and so forth. But here's my question for you, as regards India. Do you think that, like, this sort of like potential lowering of labor costs, do you think that if that were implemented, do you think that would have any success in actually attracting extensive investment in light of the state of infrastructure and productive capital in India? What do you think the odds are that such a policy could actually?
No, I don't see any. No, because that is not the only one that China is doing, right? There's no comparable infrastructure that exists in India. I mean that cannot be the only thing which will attract investment to India. So far we haven't seen any tangible gains, and despite the rhetoric. And not many supply chains move to India. They don't have any plans to move to India right now, at least. Especially, I'm researching on the auto industry in India, so I haven't read reports of large-scale investment in India. In fact, as you pointed out, General Motors left India, and I don't see anything of that sort happening right now. So I think this competition with China is more of an ideological ploy than a real change in policymaking.
Okay, or a pretext to just sort of, to batter organized labor.
Yes, that's what I feel. Because the public sector unions have been,
okay, continue. I just meant it doesn't seem like the apparatus is actually there to seriously compete in any case.
Yes. So the public sector unions have been pretty aggressive so far, but now that there is a strong push to privatize, in the insurance sector, banking, railways, and all sorts of state-owned companies and resources, there is a possibility that there could be a backlash against the government. So that, if these changes are introduced by different state governments, a united trade union movement could be preempted. That could be a reason why they were moved swiftly during the pandemic. There are a lot of restrictions and protests and so on, so that could be a reason. But yeah, the China thing, it's more rhetoric than anything substantial.
Thank you for that very enriching response. And it reminded me of a piece of fake news that circulated during the pandemic. So there was news about, and it actually turned out to be false, but about T-shirts that circulated that were accusing China of being guilty of creating the pandemic. That were apparently the idea was that they were very popular in India, but I guess this piece of fake news, it claimed that while these shirts that were anti-Chinese were being worn in India, they were being made in China. So the Chinese were profiting from them. So this is a really surreal kind of, commentary on our current impasse, right? But Juan, you wanted to say something. I want to get around to you.
Yeah, I was going where you asked Conrad, because what Charvaak is relating of what is happening in India is what we lived in Latin America since the 90s. No, you have to liberalize, you have to lower labor costs to attract FDI and so on, but it never happened. Only happened in Mexico because they are next door to the US, so supply chains are really short and what else? So I was especially wondering, Conrad partly addressed this in his second question, but what are the odds or what are the economic determinants of India wrestling its way to attract FDI with having Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, next door, which are really low cost, really. So you have to dismount everything India has done for the past 30 years, and it wouldn't make any difference. So I think, well, for capital, there is a difference, but in terms of political dynamics in India, how is the national government of India selling this idea of going to the cliff and jumping with wages going down, with trade unions going down? What are the odds of this working out in the next month? You clearly stated that you expect that some kind of backlash from the public trade unions is going to work, but what are the dynamics medium term? Is India going where? What's the project of Modi in the national government?
I don't know. It's perhaps going nowhere.
No, but I mean, because in Latin America, it's quite. It lasted 10 years. The neoliberal wave from the 90s. We all ended in collapse, especially Argentina. We had a pink wave, central left decade in the first decade of the 21st century, and now we are mixed, looking to where we're going to go. But we lost 20 years of economic development in that struggle, and it's really sad to see India in the same pathway now, exacerbating nationality and whatever.
We don't have a very strong left-based political parties. The centrist party, the Congress party, is not very different when it comes to economic policies, especially with regard to labor laws. A little flexible here and there, but more or less they're on the same page. So I don't see any sort of reversal of these policies in the near future, unless there is some sort of really the workers, the working population feel the pinch of it, and without any protection and so on, they fight back. But then there are other political currents are at work, which is, of course, nationalism is there, but patriotism and all sorts of right-wing ideologies are at play. So that is kind of neutralizing the anger the workers population might have, or they have, against the changes. The changes, it will take some time for these changes to take effect on the ground in industries, maybe 6 to 8 months to 1 year, in a more broad way, widely. But I don't know. I mean, I cannot. It's difficult to speculate what's going to happen in, let's say, if not a few months, let's say 5 years or 10 years. Now, I don't see a reversal of these policies right now, because most of the political parties, I mean, this apart from the centrist party, the regional-based parties, which are running governments in different provinces, they don't have any separate distinct economic agenda. They are more or less, I mean, on social issues, political issues, they may be against the government, but on economic issues, they are on the same page. So I don't know where it is going, right? I mean, I don't know if it is a good answer, but I don't see a reversal of these policies in medium term, not in, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years. I don't see anything changing.
Okay, well, thank you guys. And thank you overall for a really, really great panel on Marxism and political economy. I feel like I definitely, as a philosopher who likes to sort of, dip my toes into political economy, I always feel like when I do these kind of things that I have a lot to learn. So it's always really enriching. So thank you guys so much. And thanks for the audience for being here. Thanks for, though I won't say his name on camera as he doesn't require it. Thank you as well for our behind the scenes guy in tech. And I hope for the audience, as well as for some of the presenters here, that maybe we'll see you at some of the later panels in the conference, viewing them, if not presenting. And if not, perhaps at next year's historical materialism, which will hopefully be in person, right? Then we can stop at the pub for a drink and not be, encumbered by this terrible sort of impersonal apparatus here, right? So thank you all so much. And we will see you soon at our next panel for HM 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you.